All right, welcome to this explainer. Today we're going to unpack a massive theological mystery, and honestly, it's one that's been hiding right in plain sight. We are asking the big question. What was the original Christian message, according to the actual historical texts? Because, for centuries, billions of people have held a very specific view of the Christian afterlife. But according to a deep dive into the source texts we're looking at today, that popular understanding might actually be missing the entire core of what the original message was all about. It's a literal paradigm shift, and we are going to explore exactly what these documents claim.
Okay, let's dive into this. We're looking at a pretty stark comparison here. On one hand, we have the traditional view. That's the widespread cultural assumption we all know, the idea that the ultimate goal of salvation is going up to an ethereal heaven as a disembodied soul when you die. But on the other hand, we have the source's view. And the texts we're examining make a startling claim. They argue the original goal was never about leaving Earth at all. Instead, it's about inheriting a renewed Earth and literally co-ruling a global government. So yeah, it's a complete shift from an otherworldly hope to a very grounded, entirely earthly one.
The absolute crucial point here is how the sources define the central message of Jesus, which they call the gospel of the kingdom. The texts neutrally define this, and this is key, not as some vague internal spiritual feeling, but as a literal world government established on a renewed earth by the Messiah. The authors heavily emphasize that this future government is deeply political and territorial. It's literally about a new administration eventually taking over the globe to restore order, justice, and peace.
Revelation 5:10 really brings this into sharp focus. Just listen to this specific quote. "They will reign as kings upon the earth." The source material highlights how incredibly literal this statement is meant to be. It argues that the ultimate destiny of believers, according to the text, is to hold executive, administrative positions, to rule as kings right here on earth. We're not talking about floating on clouds playing harps. We're talking about actively managing an actual, renewed global society.
Tracing this paradigm back through ancient history reveals this amazing building block effect. It starts way back, around 2000 BC, with a literal land promise made to Abraham. Then, it flows to 1000 BC with the establishment of David's royal throne in Jerusalem, which kind of sets up the blueprint for divine monarchy. According to the sources, when Jesus arrives in the first century, he isn't starting something totally new, he is announcing the imminent arrival of that exact promised kingdom, the restoration of David's throne. And finally, all of that points directly to the future, to the renewed earth where this government is permanently established.
Now, the absolute foundation of all this is the Abrahamic land promise. The sources argue that God's covenant with Abraham was absolutely not a spiritual metaphor. They view it as a literal, legally binding real estate oath. It was a guarantee of perpetual ownership of a specific territory in the Middle East, a territory which would eventually serve as the headquarters for this global earthly empire. The text insists that this land promise is literally the bedrock of everything that follows in the Christian message.
So reading it this way completely flips how we interpret famous passages. Take Matthew 5:5, for example. The meek will inherit the earth. We almost always hear this treated as a nice, poetic sentiment. But the sources claim Jesus' words here are absolutely not a metaphor. They argue he is making a direct legal continuation of that literal Abrahamic land promise we just talked about. To inherit the earth in this framework means literally taking ownership and administrative control of the planet.
This really forces us to contrast two totally different paradigms. On one side, you have the popular modern idea of the kingdom in the heart, the idea that Jesus was basically teaching an ethical, internal rule for personal morality. But on the other side, you have the text's presentation of the kingdom on earth, a highly political, territorial government. The authors essentially present Jesus not merely as a moral philosopher, but as a theocratic political campaigner who is actively recruiting executives for a future world administration.
Well, that brings us to a massive question, doesn't it? How does this paradigm shift change the path to personal salvation? Think about it. If we shift the focus entirely from escaping to heaven over to preparing to govern a renewed earth, how does that fundamentally alter the actual mechanism of getting saved? What are the actual requirements to get a seat in this future global government?
To answer that, the sources point us straight to the famous parable of the sower. Now, historically, people have read this as a general moral story about just, being a good listener. But the authors view this parable entirely differently. They argue it is the exact structural blueprint for salvation. It's literally the mechanical formula for how human beings gain access to this future earthly kingdom and ultimately achieve immortality.
In this framework, the seed isn't just a generic belief in Jesus or a warm feeling of faith.
It is defined very specifically as the gospel message of the kingdom. It's the exact political, earthly kingdom message we've been outlining this whole time. The authors heavily emphasize that you absolutely must have the right seed, meaning this specific information about the coming world government, for the process of salvation to even begin.
So, how do human beings react to this specific seed? The text structures spiritual reception into 4 observable responses. First, it can be snatched away by the devil, which represents complete blindness to the message. Second, it can fall away due to persecution or hardship. Third, it can be choked out by the everyday worries and distractions of life. Or fourth, and this is the goal, it can be received by an honest heart, where it takes root and produces the ultimate result, salvation.
Looking at those 4 responses, we really have to ask the ultimate question. So, how is salvation actually achieved in this framework? If the seed is a specific message and the soil is our reaction to it, what is the mandatory first step to make sure we are that 4th type of soil? How do we become the honest heart that successfully receives the kingdom message?
Matthew 13:19 gets us a startlingly direct answer to that. It says, "When anyone hears the gospel of the kingdom and does not understand it, the devil comes and snatches away what was sown." The authors argue that failing to intellectually understand this specific political message about the earthly kingdom is exactly what leaves a person vulnerable. Basically, without comprehension of the kingdom message, the devil simply snatches the opportunity for salvation right away.
This introduces a concept that texts make absolutely mandatory, which we can call intelligent reception. The sources make it super clear that intellectual comprehension of the earthly kingdom is the essential first step to salvation. It's not just about having an emotional reaction at all. It's about grasping the data. You have to intelligently receive and understand the plan for the messianic world government before you can even be saved to participate in it.
Wrapping up the text's argument, we get to what's described as the spark of immortality. The authors describe how this specific seed, this intelligent reception of the kingdom message, is seen as the literal elixir of life. When a person hears this very specific message, understands it, and holds on to it despite all of life's worries, the sources argue that it acts as a divine spark. It literally germinates immortality within the believer and guarantees their place in that future renewed earth.
We've covered a lot of ground in this explainer today, and honestly, it leaves us with a truly provocative thought to end on. What if the core message of Jesus has been fundamentally misunderstood for centuries? Because if these sources are right, the entire goal of the Christian message isn't about leaving Earth at all, but about intelligently preparing to government. It's an absolutely fascinating paradigm shift that really challenges everything we thought we knew, leaving us pretty eager to investigate these ancient texts for ourselves.